this is a relatively new one for sailing. Owen had just put this together. So would you like to detail here what you as a coach would be looking for? And actually probably more so, there's a lot of planned versus completed. I want to understand what happens in a sailing environment, and sport to sport, planned versus completed is always varied. That there are some sports where if it's planned, it happens. Even in club, there are some clubs where if it's planned, it's happened. If we're talking AFL or anything like that, what is the emphasis here on planned versus completed, and why is it such an emphasis in sailing?
So I'm going to have to give a shout out to the rest of our sports science, sports management team. We've got some really, really good people working around us. So I'm going to be talking slightly outside of my area. This is, this is an area that's really focused on by our physiology team and their work. But talking to the context of sailing is an extremely interesting one. Again, coming out of a teams-based background where we plan and then we can, manipulate on the run. Running a team of teams as well. We've got multiple coaches. And also the third big factor is we're very much dictated by wind. So windier days may happen later on in the day. So whether or not we execute a strength training session in the morning or a cross training session in the morning may differ based on whether we've got conditions or not. Travel is a big one for us. Coaches and athletes will travel at the moment within Australia and right now within the state to make sure we're getting the right sea conditions, right wind conditions and movement. So as soon as you start moving outside of our national training centre where we have everything, as you'd assume, now we could be, on the northern, north coast of New South Wales in quite small towns trying to look for sea state, wind state, where therefore we may not have the same strength capacities in terms of gym or what's available. So I suppose coming back to training load, lots of variables going on all the time. So we can have an idea about what we want planned, but with a forever changing environment, sometimes we're able to achieve it and sometimes we're not. Sailing's a sport where, depending on the class, a race can last between 25 and 40 minutes. You can do anywhere between 2 to 4 races a day, depending on what sort of conditions the competition has had. And then you're usually at about 5 days of regatta. So, we're really looking at a sport that takes a large amount of volume can be up to, 25 hours worth of sailing at a regatta, but it can be also down to about, 18 to 20. So in terms of training volume, we're looking at making sure that athletes are able to cope with the duration of an event, but also able to cope with the duration of an event that maybe is of quite high intensity. So if we've got an event that has high winds and they're able to get multiple races done a day, they may get done, in 5 days, and it might be shorter windows, but the intensity of what they've got to go through is actually quite high. It's also a sport where, the bigger winds we have can be more taxing of dealing with the elements, but you might not have to do as much physical work. So moving the boat, pumping the boat, those sorts of endurance-based elements may not be needed if we've got higher winds. So we've really got these 3 different levels. You've got light wind sailing, which is very technical and tactical. You've got heavy wind sailing, which with our fast boats can definitely be like racing a car around a racetrack. And then you've got the middle one where you've got to almost manhandle the boat around the course, or woman handle. The athletes have to really drive the boat itself. So in terms of coming back to training load or referencing it, these are all the areas that we've got to consider. We also, need to be aware of what's relevant for different classes and what sort of cross training is meaningful. So that's the other part of our daily training that we need to be aware of. I think finally, training load has been, consistently across most sports, heart rate versus intensity, or duration versus intensity, or different, variables like that. We have some of our classes that use pseudo or semi-isometric contraction. So hiking athletes, so those athletes that stick their feet under the strapping and hang out off the side of a boat. So they can run very, very high heart rates without necessarily going through range. So it can actually throw out load scores quite dramatically. It can underestimate or overestimate depending on what the athlete's been doing. So there's a number of areas that we need to consider. So coming back to the plan versus actual, we can blow out definitely by up to about 20% sometimes, but it all comes back to the coaching and the communication and the relationship we have with coaches and athletes about daily conversation. How are they feeling? How are they coping with training? And then continuing to adapt and manipulate as we go forward. It's on a weekly basis. In the past, as Owen has shown, they were PDFs that were sent out. Now this is on our dashboard so that the coaches we can have these conversations with athletes. You know, we still look at significant increases and decreases in load from week to week. The fatigue, it can change athletes' fatigue state quite dramatically. Depending on the regatta that's coming up, the expected wind conditions, the flights, the travel on ground and all those sorts of things, different manipulations of the planned training volumes will be made. And then also for us, it depends at what level our athletes are at. So we've got some quite senior athletes. Athletes are around in sailing for a very long time. You know, you've got in Rio, there was an athlete who was in his early 50s who won a gold medal in a catamaran class. So, you know, you can be around for a very, you know, it's not a sport that you age out of very easily. So these are all factors in terms of what training volume is prescribed, what modalities are being used to create those training scores, those volume load scores, and then also what's being done on the water. So in terms of education for athletes, it's critical because it's different class to class, skipper to crew, and then also age of athlete and development stage.